Hello, this is Tucker from the Math and Physics Research Center at SVSU, and in this video we're going to go over applications of quadratic equations. So in the previous sections we've just been solving equations that the book gives us as questions, but in this section we're going to have to actually make the equations ourselves to begin with and then solve them. So looking at example 1, it reads, a picture frame's length is 4 inches more than double its width. If its area is 96 inches squared, what are the dimensions of the frame? The dimensions just being the length and the width. So in the end here, we're looking to solve for both L, the length, and W, the width. And then it tells us that the area is 96, which we also know is length times width. So if we look back at this first sentence in the question, it tells us that the length, L, is 4 inches more than, so 4 plus, double its width, 2W. So with these two equations that we've got now, we have a nice little substitution problem set up. So we can take this 4 plus 2W, substitute it in for L, and solve for W, the width. So if we plug that in real quick, we end up with 4 plus 2W times W is still equal to that 96 that the area is, 6. So if we simplify this left side out, we end up with, I'm going to switch it around just to make it easier, 2W squared plus 4W equals 96. So now remember, if we want to solve a quadratic, we'll have to get this right side equal to 0. So we'll subtract that 96 over, end up with 2W squared plus 4W minus 96 equals 0. So now we can start solving this equation. First off, by just looking at the coefficients of every term, we've got a 2, a 4, and a 96. So since these are all even numbers and we're starting with a 2, we can pull a 2 out front and leave us with W squared plus 2W minus 48, and that's still equal to 0. So now if we factor this quadratic out a bit more, remember we're going to have to find two factors that multiply to be negative 48 but add up to be positive 2. So let's figure out the factors of 48 first. So we've got 1 and 48, 2, 24, 3 and 16, 4 and 12, and 6 and 8. So if we want these sets of factors to add up to 2 but multiply to be negative 48, that means that we're going to have a smaller number being negative. So we'll have these negative, but the bigger number stays positive since it needs to multiply negative but add up to be positive. So if we look at each one of these pairs and add the numbers up, this first one, 47, clearly not what we need. This one, 22, again, not what we need. 13, 8, and finally 2. So since this one ends up adding up to positive 2, this will be the pair that we choose. So we'll leave that 2 from the outside there and factor this out. So we get W minus 6, W plus 8, and still equal to 0. So from this step, remember we break this up into the two different problems where we take each of these factors, the W minus 6 equal to 0, and the W plus 8 is equal to 0. So this one tells us that W can be equal to 6, and this one tells us that W can be equal to negative 8. So remember the context of the problem. We have a picture frame, and we're dealing with its width in inches. So with these two solutions for the width, the negative 8 kind of is irrelevant. Since we can't have a negative width, we're going to just take that positive 6. So remember we also needed the length because they wanted both dimensions. So if w is equal to 6, and we know that the length is 4 plus 2w, we can take that length equals 4 plus 2w and plug that 6 in to find the length. So length equals 4 plus 2 times 6, which is equal to 4 plus 12, or 16. So our dimensions for this problem, the width is 6 and the length is 16. Alright, so now, moving on to the next problem, we have an enclosure on a farm that has fencing whose width is 6 feet less than 3 times its length. If the enclosed area is 105 feet squared, what is the perimeter of the fencing? So with this one, let's start out by drawing a picture. So we've got some fencing whose width is 6 feet less than 3 times its length. So let's call this one W, this one L. We have the width is 6 feet less than 3 times its length, so we have 3 times the length, and since it's 6 feet less, we're going to subtract 6 feet from that. So we're trying to figure out the perimeter at the end. Remember, the perimeter is 2 times W plus 2 times L, and it tells us that the area is 105 feet squared. So just like the last one, we're going to be dealing with the area formula to solve out for either the length or the width first. So remember, length times width. And since we have an equation in terms of L for W, we can substitute that in again. So let's do that. We have L times 3L minus 6, and that's still equal to 105. Now we'll simplify this side. 3L squared minus 6L equals 105. And again, remember, we need this side to be equal to 0, so we'll subtract that 105. So we get 3L squared minus 6L minus 105 equals 0. And now from here, it might be a little tricky to see, but all three of these numbers have a factor of 3 that we can take out. So we'll pull that 3 out. We end up with L squared minus 2L minus 35, and that's equal to 0. And just like the last problem, we're just going to be factoring this out and solving for L. So we need to pick two factors of negative 35 that add up to be negative 2. So let's figure out those factors first. We get 1 and 35, and 5 and 7. So since we need them to add up to be negative, that means the bigger numbers will be negative in this case. So if we add these pairs up and check them, this one ends up being negative 34, which is pretty far off. But this one is negative 2. So this will be the pair of factors that we choose. And let's factor it out. So we end up with 3 times L minus 7 times L plus 5. And that's still equal to 0. So if we break this into the two different problems again, we get L minus 7 equals 0 and L plus 5 equals 0. So L can either be positive 7 or it can be negative 5. And again, since we're dealing with real life, there can't be a negative length. So this negative 5 is just going to go away. So in this case, our length is 7, and we need to figure out the perimeter, remember. So we also need the width. So since the width is 3L minus 6, width is 3L minus 6, that means the width is 3 times 7 minus 6, which is equal to 21 minus 6, or 15 feet. So now we've got our length and we have our width, and to find the perimeter, we'll just take those and multiply them by 2 and take the sum of them, and that'll be our final step. So we'll have 2 times 15 plus 2 times 7, which is 30 plus 14, which makes the perimeter of the fencing equal to 44 feet. And that's about it for the example problems. Yeah, so overall, the biggest obstacle is really setting up the problem. For me, it really helps to draw a picture like we did in this example too. Just make sure to read carefully when they're telling you the second equation that you need. Be careful about the wording and the order that they give you the numbers in. And that's about it. Thank you for watching.